Hey, welcome to our conversation today. We're going to be talking about Phylum Arthropoda, and keeping in mind that we are in the animal kingdom still, and we are still looking at invertebrates. Last time we talked about the invertebrate worms, and then we looked at Phylum Mollusca with all the soft bodies. So we're going to now look at Arthropoda. Okay, so what do all these animals have in common? Three particular things, and that's what's going to help identify them as joining Phylum Arthropoda. One is that they have jointed appendages. Remember, we didn't see that in Phylum Mollusca with their soft bodies. And the bodies are separated into segments as well. And then they also have an exoskeleton. So instead of a shell, it's an exoskeleton made up of a protein called chitin. So here are 6 characteristics of all the animals that are classified under Phylum Arthropoda. So we mentioned they have an exoskeleton and a segmented body. They do have a nervous system, and they also have what's called a compound eye. We're starting to see respiratory organs now. We saw a little bit of that in our Phylum Mollusca. If you remember, the clams had gills, but now we have more specific respiratory organs. And then animals in Phylum Arthropoda go through metamorphosis. So here are just some samples of some of the organisms that belong to Phylum Arthropoda. Everything from shrimp to ladybugs to lightning bugs, and then our lovely scorpion even as well. And of course the butterfly. Anytime you think of metamorphosis, most people think of butterflies. Okay, so let's talk about this exoskeleton. The exoskeleton is jointed because the appendages are jointed, and it's made up of chitin. Remember, we talked about that being a particular protein that's very hard. So if you look at this image on the right, this gives you an idea of what it looks like. This sample just happens to be lobster. So it has a multi-layer cuticle. And if you look, there are twisted, what we call plywoods of chitin protein planes. So each of these planes has chitin chains, and that all together is twisted into what we call a plywood. And then it does have some mineralization to make it even harder. So this is what it looks like. Here is it down even to the molecular level if you are interested in that. So what's the function of an exoskeleton? The first is the most obvious. It protects the soft body of the organism itself. It also acts as an attachment for muscles. So where our muscles attach to our skeleton, which for us is an endoskeleton within the body, the muscles of our Arthropoda species attached to their exoskeleton. So for that reason, it's used in locomotion. It also works to prevent desiccation. So whereas when we were looking back at our mollusks, remember they lived pretty much in an aquatic environment. So they didn't worry about drying out. Well, now we have these soft bodies that are living on land, so we need to prevent them from drying out, and that's what this exoskeleton helps with. Now, the disadvantage of the exoskeleton is that it doesn't expand when the organism grows. So most of our organisms within this phyla have to shed their exoskeleton and create a new one as they grow. So we mentioned that everything in this phyla has segmentation, and what we see with this segmentation is 3 body parts coming together to build its body, and that's the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. When my kids were little and learning this in kindergarten, I think, Do you know the song Head, Shoulders, Knees, and Toes? Well, my kids learned the song Head, Thorax, Abdomen, Abdomen, and they were specifically looking at this phyla. So that is now going to stick in your head. You're welcome. Also looking at the exoskeleton. Usually it is made up of, like we said, the chitin, but it's put into these hollow tubes so that it can be moved by the muscles. So that makes them lightweight. So if you look at the joint appendages down here on the left, here is our human skeleton. Like we said, that's an endoskeleton. And the muscles work to either contract or release in order to have movement. Similar thing is true of our muscles in Phylum Arthropoda. Our flexor muscles bring it in, and then we have extensor muscles that take it out. So they are jointed. The skeleton itself can be highly specialized. So an example of that is this lovely blue crab over here, and it has this enormous claw, which is mostly for display for trying to attract a mate. But there are all kinds of adaptations to these exoskeletons that various members of the Phylum Arthropoda display. As I mentioned, the members of Phylum Arthropoda do have a nervous system. They have a brain and a central nervous system. So it's not like what we saw in the worms where we had just the ventral nerve that ran down the length of the body. This is actually a pretty well-developed central nervous system. And they have well-developed senses as well. So if you look at this image up here on the right, this is just a crab, and it has a brain right here. No, it's not huge. We haven't gotten, to the most extensive life forms, but it does have a brain that works with all of these central nerves, and they have what they call a thoracic ganglia, so another section that's pretty highly developed. Of course, they have eyes and antennae so that they can sense their surroundings, and of course that's processed through the brain. It allows organisms within this group to have specialized behaviors. For instance, if you look over here to the left, here are horseshoe crabs, mating behavior. They display certain behaviors to attract mates, and we don't really see that as much in the organisms that we've talked about prior to this. Okay, on our list of characteristics, we talked about the compound eye. That's pretty unique to Phylum Arthropoda, and it's called a compound eye because it's made up of repeating units, and each one of those units functions as a separate visual receptor. So think it's almost like having thousands of eyes all working together. They don't create one image, though. They create multiple images. So this example that we have here is this fly, and as you can see all these little visual receptors. And because they're usually shaped like this, where they're almost like this bulb, they can see in 180 degrees left and right. So they typically do not have one clear vision of something, but they can detect rapid movement better than we can. And so they know when there's a threat very, very quickly. So this is what the lenses look like. With a compound eye, like we said, we get multiple images because each one of these creates an image. The simple eye, which is what we have, everything goes through a single lens, and then these receptors work together to create one image that's clear. So that's the difference between a simple and compound eye. And the compound eye is what we see in Phylum Arthropoda. Okay, respiratory organs. How do they do gas exchange? Well, there are 3 different types within this phyla. The first is gills, which work underwater, and that's like our crustaceans. Our crustaceans are like shrimp, for instance. They have gills. the second is what we call a book lung. And the book lung works like stacked pages of tissue paper almost. So that's this picture down here on the bottom. And our example of that is spiders. They have what's called a book lung. So if you look right here, that's what it looks like. And each one of those pages is thin and allows for gas exchange. So already you're starting to see the different type of classes that are in Phylum Arthropoda. Our crustaceans, our spiders, which are in class Arachnida, which should sound familiar to you. And I guess while you're here, I'll go ahead and say, remember that our class Arachnid has 8 legs, because class Insecta is also under these under Phylum Arthropoda, and they contain 6 legs. So that's how you can tell those apart. And we're going to see some of those in labs, and some of those organisms you may not be familiar with, but you can tell if it's an insect or a spider based on how many legs it has. Also by how its respiratory organs work, but I'm pretty sure that if they're really tiny, you're probably not going to be able to see it well. If they're larger, of course you can, but so the distinguishing features between those two are legs and their respiratory organs. So our third respiratory organ is what's called a trachea, and we see this in our class Insecta. And for us, our example here is going to be our grasshopper, just because it's a larger insect, so it's easier to see. And what a trachea is a tube that runs the entire length of the body, so right here, and all branching out from those tubes are what we call spiracles. So this is an enlarged version. And that spiracle literally is exposed to the outside environment. And that's where the gas exchange occurs. So you can think of it almost, well, like a breathing tube, trachea, right? I believe that's what the device is actually named after. So there's a direct connection to the external environment, and that's how gas exchange occurs in our insects. And our other characteristic for class Arthropoda is what we call metamorphosis. So its lifestyle takes it through multiple stages. And you guys are familiar with this with our butterflies that start out as a lovely caterpillar here. And as they progress, we all know they make a cocoon and a pupa comes out. And then eventually we have our butterfly that we're used to seeing. If you haven't had the opportunity, I would definitely try to go over to the Durham Life and Science Museum. They have a butterfly house, and they always have on display, like in this cabinet, butterflies that are in various stages of metamorphosis. So I highly recommend if you can get out there to see that. It's really cool. But it's not just the butterflies that do that. So over here on the right is a life cycle of a crab. So you can see where it goes through its life stage from an egg, right here, to a zoea, and then what we call the megalopola. That's this stage right here. And then metamorphosis occurs and it becomes a juvenile, and then of course up to what we typically think of as the adult crab. Okay, so now that we've looked at the characteristics of Phylum Arthropoda, I just want to take a look at 2 classes that we are pretty familiar with, just to delve into it just a little bit closer. So first is the class Insecta, and that's everything from the butterflies we talked about to this lovely horn beetle or even bees. And this is what's really cool to me about insects. Sometimes we don't realize just the neat features that they have. So there are over 1 million species of ants in the world. Just ants. And they haven't even all been identified yet. That is a lot of ants. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that I do not like ants. I don't like any group of bugs that have lots of them. However, just the fact that there's that much diversity and that number of them is pretty amazing. Just some other neat information, like little tidbits of information. Queen termite has been known to live for 50 years. That's a really long time for such a tiny little bug. Now, some insects only live for like just a few minutes, right? But 50 years, that's crazy. Okay, and then let's talk about the horsefly, which I really don't like, by the way. They hurt when they bite. But they have been clocked at 145 kilometers an hour. That's 90 miles an hour. That's so fast. So insects really are quite amazing. Just the way they're made, they have such neat features, and because they're so small, we tend to not think about them or just think about their features. But some of these little tidbits of information just make you occasionally go, wow. So I just wanted to talk about bees for just a little bit because they really are fascinating. They have a whole social structure that would baffle your mind for insects. And you can look at my notes here. I have lots of details about the different bees and what they do, but just to highlight a couple, you have certain bees that are specifically forager bees, and those are the ones that go out and they collect the pollen and the nectar, and they bring the nectar back to the hive. And then there are the worker bees that stay within the hive, and they work to feed that nectar to the young grubs or to the much older bees. And then they also, some of them have a role to actually make the honey. Once the honey is made, all the worker bees work to maintain the temperature within the hive, to dry out the honey, to evaporate the water that's in it. So they literally beat their wings at a certain pace to increase the temperature and to create a specific humidity. Once the honey reaches 18.6% humidity, very specific, it's been measured over and over again, and it's always 18.6%. Once that humidity is reached, then wax is used to seal up the honeycomb. Anything over that humidity would cause the honey to ferment, which is not what they need, right? So they're very specific. Worker bees also are used to guard the entrance to the hive so that others can't come in. There are specific bees that are bred to eventually be a queen bee. So just such a fascinating structure, socially speaking. So like I said, you can read in the notes below a little bit more detail about that, but I just wanted to pass that along because sometimes we don't think about how complex insects can be. Okay, I wanted to take a look at this just to talk about the anatomy of arthropods in general. This I'm just showing you real quickly to just point out that biologists name everything, every little thing. You do not need to know all the details on this page. I just wanted you to realize that we are just going to be touching the very tip of the iceberg about the anatomy of arthropods. So we're going to look here using these diagrams first. And to start with, we talked about the three different segmentations of an arthropod body: the head, thorax, and the abdomen. One thing that I want to point out is that in our arthropods, all of the walking legs are attached to the thorax. So that's how you know for sure it's the thorax. That's where the walking legs are attached. And in this particular instance, since we're talking about insects, you can see the trachea with the spiracles that come out the side. We can obviously have lots of adaptations on this ant. We have the antenna here, this eye, which is going to be a compound eye, and then they have these mandibles that allow them to grab onto their food. So our bee over here, again, we have our compound eye on the head. We have antennae so they can feel their surroundings. Again, the walking legs are on the thorax. And here, of course, we have a modification of the walking legs, or a modification, sorry, not a modification of walking legs, modification on the thorax, which is their wings. And then here we have the abdomen, which again, a new modification is that on bees, of course, we're going to have a stinger as well. And so when you are taking a look at the body parts, you need to remember that we always have the walking legs on the thorax of the arthropod. Okay, let's move on to a different class, class Crustacea, which is a different arthropod. They are broken down into two groups, a decapod and a copepod. So the decapod has a thorax that has 5 pairs of walking legs, right? So they have 10 total, hence why the name decapod. And their gills are positioned just above their walking legs, and the way that works is as they walk through the water, either swimming or walking on the bottom, it moves those gills to allow more water flow across it. Now, their first pair of walking legs can be modified, such as in crabs and lobsters. So that group is familiar to you as the lobsters, crabs, crayfish, shrimp, that sort of thing. Then the other group are the copepods, and they lack the compound eye that is typical of arthropods, and they lack a carapace. So let me define what a carapace is. It's the dorsal side of the exoskeleton that's especially thickened. And really the carapace that you will probably most be familiar with is if you think of a horseshoe crab. That thick plate on the back, that's a carapace. So the copepods lack that completely. And these are krill, barnacles, and water fleas. So they're usually much smaller, and they can even be part of the plankton. So those are our two different little groups of Crustacea as well. Okay, so here is a little bit more bigger example of what we call the carapace. And remember, on the inside, no matter what we're looking at for an arthropod, it still has a head, thorax, and abdomen. Now, sometimes the head and the abdomen are fused together in what we call a cephalothorax. I'm sorry, not the head and the abdomen, the head and the thorax. Sorry about that. So head and thorax together are called a cephalothorax. And typically the carapace covers that. Okay, so here it is in our horseshoe crab. Underneath would be the cephalothorax and then the abdomen. When that's the case, the walking legs are going to be attached to the cephalothorax. Here with our other Crustacea over here, we have a carapace right here as well, and it covers the head in this case. So it's that thickened part of the exoskeleton. And sorry, this is a crayfish. I'm sorry I didn't say that. And because it has a cephalothorax, these walking legs are still attached to that. Now, what's slightly different about our crayfish is that it has what's called swimmerets. That's attached to the abdomen. Those are not the walking legs. So in our crayfish, these walking legs would still be attached to gills underneath the carapace. Swimmerets are used for exactly what you would think they'd be used for. They are used for swimming. So we're going to see both of these organisms in the lab, and you will do a dissection of the crayfish, so you'll get to see that in detail. Okay, we're going to move on to phylum Echinodermata. And now we are into what we call the deuterostomes. And so our echinoderms, the examples of those are like the sea stars and our sea biscuits, several things in this category, and most of the time we think of the spikes that come with them. So looking one more time, this is your reminder of your protostomes and deuterostomes. If the mouth develops first from the blastopore, it is a protostome. If the anus develops first from the blastopore, it is a deuterostome. And here are the phyla that we've been talking about and where they line up in here. So we've talked about our mollusca, annelida, and arthropoda. Those are all protostomes. Now we are moving on to echinoderms, and those are now deuterostomes. We will move on to chordata as well later, but just for right now, we are focusing on the echinodermata. So the term echinoderm, echino being spiky, spiky derm is kind of how you can think of it. Characteristics of our echinoderm is that they have a 5-point radial symmetry, right? And that's really easy to see in our sea stars. And then they have an endoskeleton. They don't have an exoskeleton like the arthropods, but the endoskeleton is made up of what we call ossicles. And these ossicles are calcium-rich plates that act as a skeleton-like structure. And then unique to the echinoderms is that they have what's called a water vascular system. So if you look up here on our image right here, these are the different parts of the echinoderm water vascular system. And we're showing it just in the sea star because it's the easiest way to see it, but you will notice that it's all throughout various echinoderms. So some of the features that are important on it to start with is what's called the madreporite. And that is on the dorsal side, or what we would also call the aboral side. This is where the water comes into the water vascular system. And then there is this ring canal. And what you're missing on this image is that on the ventral side, also called the oral side, the mouth is right here in that center. Okay? So here's the ring canal, and then each of the, what would you say? The lines that radiate out from that are called the radial canals. So kind of going down each leg of the starfish. Okay? And then from the radial canal is what we call the tube feet. They have an ampulla on the top, which is almost like a bulb. Like, have you ever seen a bulb syringe? Those are those things that they use to suck snot out of a baby's nose. That's kind of what it looks like on the top. And then the tube feet are the portion at the bottom. What this whole water vascular system is used for is to allow water to come in through the sea star, and gas exchange occurs there. This is also how the sea star can grip things with its tube feet. And that water is also used almost like a hydrostatic skeleton as well. So we're going to do a dissection in lab to look at all these. I will have a video of the sea star dissection that is a really, really good video, and I'd like you to take a look at that. That'll be on our Sakai site, and I'll have a link for that. We'll look at that prior to coming to lab, or we may even look at it together in lab. Because sometimes when you do the dissection of a sea star, once it's out of water, it can get a little confusing as to what's what until we really take a look at it. Okay, this is something that's fascinating, actually. So I'd like you to click over to this other website, this other YouTube video, to take a look at how sea stars eat mussels. One of the important things that you need to know is that a sea star's stomach comes out of its body in order to digest its food, and then it comes back in when it's done. So take a moment and look at that. It's really fascinating. So it's not just sea stars that have